Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to bring you up to, let's call it, regulatory procedural speed before you can dive into the interesting regulatory scientific questions and discussions. So very happy to talk about the huge, let's call it huge PFAS restriction proposal. I'd like to briefly touch on the PFAS background, also based on what Dr. Hensel already lined out in his introduction, then go to the REACH restriction process, some specifics of this, and then go to the current status of our own proposal, the next steps, and the conclusion. Why a PFAS restriction? We already heard in a very interesting image with reference to spy movies about the PFAS role. So I just want to continue this by saying what's the element of PFAS? Its name is bond, the carbon-fluorine bond. Sorry, no more lame puns. But you see in the top right corner of the slide that the carbon-fluorine bond is by far the strongest single bond among main group non-metallic chemicals. So this bond strength and the bond polarity confer a range of very beneficial technical properties to carbon-fluorine molecules, or then PFAS materials. We heard already the resistance to oil, water, and dirt, or the repellency to these influences. PFAS materials are very stable under extreme conditions, ranging from temperature, pressure, radiation, and influence of other chemicals, for example, corrosives. They are very good electric and thermal insulation agents, efficient refrigerants, and they have surface active properties. So they are found in nearly all sectors of use in our everyday life, but also in more special sectors which maybe do not come to mind from the top of your head. So based on the set of properties and depending on one or more of these technical requirements, they can be found, for example, as process chemicals or metal plating agents based on their resistance to corrosive environments. They are found in firefighting foams based on their surfactant properties. They also appear in textiles. You may come across the abbreviation TULAC, which stands for textiles, upholstery, leather, apparel, and carpets. This is, let's call it a specific distinction to separate it from more technical textiles like membranes. They appear in food contact materials, further consumer products, in transportation. The fluorinated gases are important for climate devices. For example, they appear in electronics and semiconductors manufacture in the energy sector. They are important lubricants. They are based on their inertness, important for medical devices, but also in more fine chemicals, for example, in active substances. You find fluorinated groups like, for example, trifluoromethyl groups. They appear in cosmetics and even further uses not listed here. So far for their advantageous properties, but this also gives cause for concern. Their high persistence based on the carbon-fluorine bonds, high strength in combination with their properties like the tendency to bioaccumulate in fatty tissue, their mobility and long-range transport potential, leading to their occurrence in what would rather consider as pristine environments, their enrichment in plants and ecotoxicity, their endocrine effects, and also combination effects, because after all, we are talking about a very diverse, very broad group of substances. So this is relevant for monomeric PFAS, which are either by themselves very persistent or degrade to very persistent other PFAS, so-called arrowhead substances. Most often, these are perfluoroalkyl acids. You may be familiar with P4, for example, perfluorooctanoic acid, but also fluoropolymers, if you consider the whole life cycle, may lead to the emission of formation of monomeric PFAS based on their manufacturing process or their waste phase. So these PFAS remain in environmental compartments for a very long time and accumulate accordingly, though we heard about the decreasing levels from the previous speaker. The derivation of safe effects is difficult based on their diverse nature, and ultimately we can expect adverse effects from them to occur. So only on a very high level of abstraction, PFAS can lead in the human health to developmental effects, for example, effects on single target organs like the liver, tumors like in testes, breasts, or kidneys. They may decrease the immune response and the response to vaccines, and even further effects. Beyond each of these bullet points, there is stuff for one whole conference at least. So much for the hazard potential. With regard to the emissions, we can basically identify 4 different stages of PFAS emission. This is their production phase, the manufacture of products based on the PFAS chemicals, the use phase of these products, and the waste phase. With regard to the European European Economic Area, we estimate around 80,000 tons of emissions in 2020, and within 30 years, with some additional assumptions, up to 4.7 million tons of emissions. We consider this as an unacceptable risk for human health and the environment, and the need to minimize emissions results from this. So this leads to the REACH restriction process. It is a process which is divided in specific phases, and the ground laying work for each restriction is a dossier which is prepared either by a member state competent authority or the European Chemicals Agency, ECHA, in case it is requested by the European Commission. So this dossier is announced to the European Chemicals Agency in the Registry of Intentions, which is publicly available. And usually within 12 months of the preparation phase, the dossier is submitted to the European Chemicals Agency, and the public consultation of the dossier's content starts. This is limited to 6 months. And in parallel, the assessment by ECHA's scientific committee starts. This is the Committee for Risk Assessment, the RAC, and the Committee for Socioeconomic Analysis, the CERC. And based on the opinion of these 2 scientific committees and the input from the public consultation, eventually the decision-making at the Commission level is prepared, which then can take months to years. But more on the realistic timeline later. And eventually, based on the decision taken by the Commission in an implementing decision, the entry into force of the restriction conditions will take place based on the respective timelines. So with regard to the PFAS restriction, we are talking not about one member state competent agency as the dossier submitter, but actually a group of 5 member state agencies. Besides Germany, this is Denmark, the Netherlands, Norway, and Sweden. So when I talk about the dossier submitter, this is a team of agencies, and at a national level, even multiple agencies. For example, in Germany, besides our agency, the BFR, obviously, and the German Environment Agency were involved. So in January 2020, we had a kickoff between the 5 member states. This was followed by several rounds of informal information gathering among stakeholders, and the preparation of the proposal was accompanied by also meetings with stakeholders, literature research, so to get the overall picture. And in the beginning of 2023, the dossier was formally submitted to ECHA, and after the conformity of the dossier was secured by the committees, the public consultation started in March. Once the dossier is submitted, this is an Annex 15 dossier based on the format required by the REACH regulation. The dossier submitter's task is to also assess the comments gathered during the consultation, and the initial dossier becomes the background document. And this serves as the basis for the opinion of the scientific committees at ECHA. So based on the very broad use of PFAS and the very many sectors of use addressed, there is not a wholesale entire assessment, but a sector-wise, stepwise assessment based on the schedule of the meetings of the two committees. And besides the background document, also the ARCON document, the so-called response to comments document, plays a role because in this, the comments from the public consultation are reflected. So what is the current status of the restriction? Less than 2 months ago, the background document in its most recent updated version was published on ECHA's website, and it now contains the up-to-date version with all the information gained from the public consultation. And it basically contains restriction conditions on the manufacture, placing on the market, and use of substances. So in case total restriction or ban is proposed, the transitional period for this would be 18 months. This is the minimum of time granted for phasing out the use. But it also contains derogations, or at least proposals for derogations. These have either increased transitional periods of +5 or +12 years. That's where the resulting transitional period is then 6.5 or 13.5 years. Or for some specific uses, we also propose unlimited derogations. But it also contains reporting obligations and management plans for substances. 3 restriction options are reflected upon in the dossier, or in the background document, as I should say. And this is a very generic look at what a restriction option 2 would look like for an undetermined sector. We look at the different uses in the sector and investigate them regarding the availability of alternatives and see whether they are already available and implementable, whether there is still time needed for implementing these alternatives, or whether there is still research and development necessary to actually find alternatives. And based on these considerations, the 3 different transitional periods, or 4 if you consider also the unlimited derogation result. So this is not only based on our initial reflections in the dossier, but was also influenced by the comments we got during the public consultation, of course. So this leads me to what's new in the background document compared to the original dossier. The definition of PFAS we wish to address remains unchanged, but we have a refined description of the sectors. We have actually created wholly new sectors, which are now included in the background document. More on that later. We have refined the assessment of emissions to also include the waste phase and have updated the socioeconomic analysis approach. We have included a proportionality matrix regarding our considerations on the restriction options we propose. And for example, we consider that the PFAS manufacturer as a general, let's say, entry into the PFAS chemistry should still remain possible without deadline, but consider it as needing further obligations with regard to emission limits. And we included derogations for the recycling processes, the second-hand market and spare parts, as well as scientific research and development and process and product-oriented research and development. So these are specific derogations we consider as unlimited without a deadline. These are the 8 new uses and sectors which we included in the updated restriction background document. These range from sealing applications, technical textiles, which is distinct from the TULAC I alluded to in the previous slides, printing applications, machinery, military applications, other medical applications, for the industrial applications and explosives. These sectors overlap, obviously. So there is not a clear distinction between some uses, and partially they are covered across multiple uses. For example, for transport, we find obviously elements of transport in the transport sector and described in the background document, but also in the electronics and semiconductors element, the lubricant sealing applications, machinery, technical textiles. So it's a complex interdependence, let's say. I alluded to 3 restriction options. I already mentioned the first one as a total ban with a 18-month transition period. This is not the one we would propose as a dossier submitter. I alluded to restriction option 2 already, but restriction option 3 would include additional requirements for it to take actually effect in case the identified risks during the complete life cycle are sufficiently addressed and the emissions are already minimized. It would need to be generally applicable and enforceable with regard to the measures, and this would need to be based on very robust information provided in the consultation. And we have examples for this in the background document. For example, in case closed systems occur and we already have limit values for wastewater or exhaust air, or already existing take-back systems or collecting systems for the end-of-life phase. These sectors for which restriction option 3 would potentially come into mind would be manufacturers, some elements of transport, and sealing applications. So these are our considerations as dossier submitters, but we are not in charge of the scientific assessment of the independent scientific committees of ECHA. Obviously, we only support their work. So our background document and our comments and the comments from the consultation are the basis for the opinion making of the 2 scientific dossiers of ECHA, with the RAG task to consider the hazard or risk of the identified substance group which should be restricted, the emissions occurring, and the assessment of the alternatives, with the socioeconomic assessment committee having also a look at the alternatives, the cost associated with a transfer to them, the impact of restriction options with regard to cost-benefit analysis, and the enforceability of the restriction options. So based on these elements, we will eventually obtain 2 separate opinions of RAC and SEAC, which are then the basis for further decision-making by the Commission. What has so far been covered in the stepwise approach I alluded to, the PFAS group is by far the most ambitious restriction proposal so far. So the grouping approach was looked at by RAC and SEAC, the hazard and risk description, the emissions and the assessment standards were clarified. So this is already publicly available based on the discussion in the working groups of the dossier of the committees and let's say the drafting process of the opinion. So multiple sectors of use were already looked at by the two committees, with some still missing, obviously. And when we look at what last month occurred, there were two plenary meetings of the two committees, the electronics and semiconductors and the lubricants sector were looked at. The energy sector was looked at by the Socioeconomic Committee, and the manufacturing and overarching issues like recycling were also addressed. What is still outstanding is the continuum of the PFAS manufacture, the discussion of these overarching issues, which are quite complex, and the electronics and semiconductors discussion by the Socioeconomic Committee. Further information on this can be seen on ECHA's website. So what will happen next? REACH foresees at least public consultation on the draft opinion of the Socioeconomic Committee, which with a 60-day duration. So we expect this around spring next year. The finalized opinions of the two committees and the final background document will then be forwarded to the European Commission, which in combination with the REACH committee, where the member states are represented at a political level, comes to a conclusion based on a Commission proposal how to proceed with the restriction, and hopefully eventually the restriction will become effective and the restriction conditions will enter into force. So this SEAC consultation is still outstanding. As I said, we expect it somewhere at the beginning of 2026, but preparation can already start now based on knowledge we have from previous consultations on older restriction processes under REACH. So this can be reflected upon and taken into account based on research on ECHA's website. The Registry of Restriction Intentions until outcome has a good overview on previous processes. The SEAC opinion obviously concerns also the reflection of the submissions from the first consultation. So in case even further refinement of these data is possible, the submission of this additional data, for example, tonnages, information on alternatives of substitution plans, is of value to this finalization of the draft opinion. And obviously, the background document, which has now been published for 7 weeks, is the basis for what you can provide beyond this. Important at this stage is that the information you provide is as targeted and usable as possible. So the perfect submission would be representative or give a representative outlook at a sector or EU-wide data, and the information should obviously be comprehensible and usable. So position papers are of no use to the committees. I'd like to conclude. We consider this restriction proposal to address an identified risk for the environment and the human health stemming from the different life cycles of PFAS and the materials from which result from their further use. The overarching aim of the restriction proposal is to minimize further environmental emissions. As a dossier submitter group, we have updated the dossier to serve now as the background document. This work has been concluded, and now it's in the last leg of the scientific opinion making. There was still inclusion of additional sectors and refined derogations, as well as new restriction options. But as I said, the assessment of both committees is still ongoing. We can share some preliminary conclusions based on the things they looked at. And with regard to the SEAC consultation, we encourage all stakeholders and interested parties to already prepare their contribution. And the European Chemicals Agency also plans to host a webinar at the end of this month where they share further guidance with interested parties regarding the input they expect for this socioeconomic analysis draft opinion. And as the German National Help Desk for REACH, we also plan on an additional information event on this SEAC consultation on 10th of December. So all German speakers are invited to also look at this event. And with this small overview, I'd like to thank you very much for your kind attention and look forward to your questions and the conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian, for this interesting talk. I guess it's a really complex and long process. So, are there any questions on site or in the chat?
No question, but a remark from Wiebke Dost from the German Environmental Agency. She emphasized that we need to differentiate between different compartments and declining trends of PFAS. There may be a declining trend in blood for some PFAS, but there's not such trend in the environment. Maybe this confers to the introduction speech.
Yes. I think Wiebke for this very important clarification, because it's not a proposal which is solely limited or targeted at environmental protection or human relevance. So it's actually a combined, very complex approach. And we have to take into account very different monitoring data, different streams, and different tendencies and correlations. Yeah. Thank you.
So I'm interested in the fluoropolymers. I've seen the word on one slide in the beginning, I guess. Are fluoropolymers, suggested to be within the scope or outside? And if so, why? And does this refer to all fluoropolymers?
They have been included already in the initial scope of the restriction dossier at its point of submission, but let's say their assessment in the background document has been refined based on the additional information from the public consultation. But yeah, the fluoropolymers are considered as a source of PFAS, mainly based on their manufacture and waste stage. So they are actually addressed in one very specific paragraph of the suggested restriction entry. But obviously, we are talking about very long, very complex suggestions for restriction conditions, which are at this stage a proposal by the dossier submitter. We don't know what the committees will make of these and what the Commission eventually will take from these to build their own proposal for the political decision making.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so one more question on the derogations. There will be, or there are some derogations suggested in the proposal, right? And my question is, are there transparent criteria when a use or an application is derogated from the scope or from the restriction? So I think it's really hard to say, okay, this application is so important or so essential that it is derogated and this use is not.
Obviously, as a representative of the dossier submitters, of course, there are transparent criteria, but it's difficult, as you say. And you already mentioned the keyword essential. The EU has been discussing the concept of an essential uses or essentiality of uses for the past few years. But so far, we do not have this as a usable concept in legislation. So what we try to accomplish with the the background document is to make clear the data upon which we base the socioeconomic analysis of the uses we look at. How difficult is it to establish alternatives or to encourage a phase out? Is it actually possible at all? We do not have high quality data for all of these considerations, but we try to make it as transparent as possible in the dossier background document where information is missing or it's based on lower quality information. And this is actually also something where it's worth to look in the background document and think about what to contribute to the refined final opinion of the Socioeconomic Analysis Committee. We can only provide an opinion based on the data as well as we receive it.